for vintage year 2012. Are we talking about wine? Let me get to page 208. Carbon derivative markets. Now, we've already heard enough about credit default swaps, but I think most of you know that under this section, the Commodity Exchange Act is amended by striking or an agricultural commodity and inserting an agricultural commodity or any emission allowance, compensatory allowance, offset credit, federal renewable electricity credit established or issued under this act. So now we're going to let those governed under the CFTC trade these credits with others around the world. And on page 209, talks about the effect of derivatives regulatory reform legislation. Upon passage of this legislation, that includes derivatives regulatory reform, sections 351, 352, 354, 355, 356, and 357 shall be repealed. Any idea of the derivatives regulations that we're repealing in this bill? You probably didn't know we were doing that. And on page 210, to prevent an increase in greenhouse gas emissions in other countries other than the United States, I presume that means countries like India and China, to induce foreign countries, and in particular fast-growing developing countries, to take substantial action with respect to their greenhouse gas emissions. India and China have made it perfectly clear to every one of us that they have no interest and will not go down this path. Further goes on to ensure that the measures described in subpart 2 are designed and implemented in a manner consistent with applicable international agreements to which the United States is a party. You know, the very structure of the border provisions, however, makes this impossible to achieve. You know, the Wall Street Journal said the other day and suggested that this bill really could start a trade war, and if we begin to try to impose our bureaucracy on other countries, we could just have that. Let me get to page 225. Distribution of emission allowance rebates. And further down the page it says, shall be pursuant to the entity's indirect carbon factor as calculated under subsection B3. Can anybody tell me how to calculate an indirect carbon factor or what an indirect carbon factor is? Let me get to page 226. Not more than 85% of the United States imports for that sector are produced or manufactured in countries that have met at least one of the criteria in that section. Then the 10-year reduction schedule set forth in the subsection shall begin in the next vintage year. So now we're going to try to control imports from countries based on what they're doing with regard to their energy policy. Use of data to determine factor, page 231. Where it is not possible to determine the precise electricity emissions intensity factor for an entity using the methodology in Clause 1. In what instances would it not be possible to determine what that is? Let me get to page 233. In each eligible industrial sector every 4 years, using an average of the 4 most recent years of the best available data, for the purposes of the list required to be published no later than February 1, 2013, the administrator shall use the best available data for the maximum number of years, up to 4 years, for which data are available. Why every 4 years? What's this data used for? Then it goes on, the administrator shall limit the average direct greenhouse gas emissions per unit of output calculated under paragraph 4 for any eligible industrial sector to an amount that is not greater than it was in any previous calculation under this section. So what's the cost of this provision? Or on page 234, the administrator shall use data from the greenhouse gas registry established under Section 713. Well, how much is this going to cost? Promoting international reductions in industrial emissions, page 236. Congress finds that for the purposes of this subpart, as set forth in Section 761C, can be most effectively addressed and achieved through agreements negotiated between the United States and foreign countries. It is the policy of the United States to work proactively under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and other appropriate fora to establish binding agreements, including sectoral agreements, committing all major greenhouse gas emitting nations to contribute equitably to the reduction of global greenhouse emissions. The bottom line of all of this is all pain for the United States citizens and no gain. Then we get to page 237. The President shall provide a notification on climate change described in paragraph 2 to each foreign country, the products of which are not exempted under Section 768. This is less than a fig leaf here. They're trying to pretend that this notification will satisfy the consultation required by the WTO rules. It won't end there, and it's going to result in retaliation against United States exports. Then we get further down that page, requesting the foreign country to take appropriate measures to limit the greenhouse gas emissions in those countries. So if they're really nice, they won't have to, but if we can force them to adopt our bizarre regulatory scheme. Then we get to page 238. The United States negotiating objectives with regard to multilateral environmental negotiations. So here we are telling the administration what their objectives are going to be as they negotiate environmental issues with our countries, other countries around the world. Presidential reports, page 239. Not later than January 1st, 2017, and every 2 years thereafter, the President shall submit a report to Congress on the effectiveness of the distribution of emission allowances under rebates Part 1 in mitigating carbon leakage in eligible industrial sectors. Let me go to page 260. Let's go to page 260. Modification of earned income credit amount for individuals with non-qualifying children. Why does this bill neglect middle-class families in America? Why is it that we're only going to help some people who will qualify for the earned income credit for individuals with no qualifying children? Further down here it says, the Secretary determines experienced a reduction in purchasing power as a result of the provisions of this Act. It's a flat-out admission that every American is going to pay more for all of their energy. And it goes on and on and on and on. Ladies and gentlemen, does this give you some idea of why the American people think their Congress is out of touch? The idea that the federal government can create this giant bureaucracy to try to control how much CO2 gets into the atmosphere. We know that if we were to do our all-of-the-above energy strategy, we'd see renewable sources of energy on the scene, available, producing jobs more quickly than under the underlying bill. We know that under our bill, you can actually have nuclear energy plants being built, cleaning up the air at a much faster rate than the underlying bill. But there's really a big underlying difference between our approach and the approach of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And that is trusting the American people. You give the American people, if we give the American people the right incentives,